Hey, hi, and hello, everyone. Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd. Hope you're doing well, and it's time for a tier list. You may ask, Anthony, you have done many of these tier lists before. What exactly are you tiering out, guy? Well, what I'm tiering out in this video are the top 10 albums from the 1990s as according to Pitchfork.com. A while back, they came out with a top 150 albums of the 1990s. The top 10 specifically I'm grabbing from that list, and yeah, I'm going to tier them out on this list here. Let's start with the record that lands at number 10 on their list. That would be Nirvana's Nevermind. 1991 record from Kurt and the gang, and in my opinion, it is one of the best rock albums of the 90s, point blank, period. And yes, In Utero is great as well, but I'm not here for like all the production on this one, the In Utero is more raw, this record's too overproduced. No, it's not. The performances are awesome. The record is wild as heck. Songs are great. Dave Grohl's killing it on the drums. The bass lines are solid. Kurt's guitar work is really good. Plus the vocal performances are mwah, 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 mwah. Rarely do you get a record that is this like tight, all killer, no filler. As far as like, the predominant vibe of angst that was just seeping into almost every aspect of 90s rock and singer-songwriter music. Kurt really set the tone for it in a way that was often imitated, but never done quite to the skill level and, the emotional potency that Kurt brought to the table. I think this is an excellent album. Its praises cannot be sung high enough. I would put it in the S tier in a big fat way. Okay, next on their list above Nevermind, they had the Tribe Called Quest album Low End Theory. I guess in case you didn't know, these guys are a legendary New York hip hop outfit. Phife Dawg and Q-Tip were in top form on this LP. The groovy, drum heavy, and jazz laced instrumentals from Cut to Cut are fantastic as well. Just a lot of lyrical wit showcased throughout this record. In my opinion, quite possibly the best jazz rap album of all time, and personally my favorite Tribe record. Yeah, I mean, looking back, while I do also love Organized Confusion as well as Diggable Planets, Roots as well, Things Fall Apart, records like that, there's not really a single jazz rap LP from this era, in my opinion, that bests Low End Theory. I feel like this album is like pretty much the gold standard, the blueprint for this sound, for this style. Its slickness, its charisma, it's everything. This is also another album that I can't say enough positive things about and have loved for much of my life. I think Pitchfork made another solid call putting this in the top 10 for sure. I would also put this in the S tier. I think we're going to be dealing with a lot of S's in this video. Okay, next at number 8 on the list, we have the Hole album, Live Through This. Hole, famously the band fronted by singer and songwriter Courtney Love. Pitchfork placing this at number 8 very strategically, just above Nevermind on this list, I think was kind of a cheeky take on their part. Clearly they were trying to make a statement of some sort, and while I do understand that the ethos and politics and the lyrical content of the songs on this record have made it undergo a very positive critical reassessment in recent years, because the deep and visceral disgust that Courtney showcases on this record for sexism from song to song to song has become more widely accepted and adopted. More people reacting to the content of this record saying, hell yeah, she has a freaking point. Certainly a welcome reaction from, she killed Kurt. In so many ways, since the release of this record, Courtney has been shafted by the exact anti-woman biases that she was railing against on this record. And in retrospect, I'm glad the album has been receiving some of the positive acclaim it's long deserved. But is this a top 10 album of the 90s and even better than the Kingpin grunge album of all time, Nevermind? No, of course not. Not only because in so many ways this album just pretty much falls in lockstep with many of the other aesthetics of grunge that were prevailing at the time without putting an interesting spin on any of it. But there are a lot of weak performances on this record as well, not just instrumentally, but vocally too. Despite Courtney's rage on many of these tracks, her singing only takes some of these songs so far, and it's rare that you get a moment that is so consistent from end to end, like Doll Parts, which is probably my favorite track from the LP. So while, yeah, I think a lot of the hate Courtney has received over the 90s and 2000s was not deserved, and this record shouldn't have been, shelved and ignored in the way that it was, critically anyway, because there were legitimate hits off this LP. Still, this is kind of a case of me messing with the ethos and the lyrical content of a project more than the substance of the performances and the music itself. And look, there are far worse and far weaker grunge-centric LPs out there for sure. You could do worse than live through this, but also you could do much better as well. Not just in terms of the genre that it exists in, but if we're talking about, this list and it being a top 10, and we're trying to make a space for unbridled feminine rage, something like that. There are artists who have that in spades, but are doing it with better songwriting, more compelling performances, be that Fiona, be that PJ Harvey. Even if you want to go Riot Girl, Bikini Kill, who I think in comparison with Hole are a lot more, biting, irreverent, sometimes even funny. But yeah, Hole, Live Through This, I'm not as crazy about it. I would probably throw it in the sea. Not the ocean, I mean the C tier. Okay, next on the list we have Janet Jackson's Velvet Rope, a record that I did a classic review of not too long ago, I don't think. I love this album. I think it's one of the best pop records of this era, one of the most forward-thinking and artsy pop records of the era. This is quite possibly Janet's best album in her catalog, and I think the magic of that lies in the fact that she shows herself to be a bit of a jack of all trades on this thing. We get some art pop and R&B and dance music and trip hop, neo-soul stuff as well, not to mention some of her most beautiful songs of all time land on this record, some of her most timeless production as well, because, while I do love Rhythm Nation, it does very much feel like, a product of its time. Velvet Rope, I think, has aged much better, was even ahead of the curve in many respects, and, a complete and utter masterpiece in Janet's discography. I would throw this one up in the S tier for sure. All right, at number 6 on Pitchfork's list, we have the Björk record, Homogenic, which is certainly one of the better albums in her discography. One of the most definitive art pop albums of the 1990s. I think her very mystical and otherworldly sound in some respects was still in development on this album, but nonetheless, this is still a great LP. It's a record that, like Rhythm Nation, as I was mentioning earlier, does feel a bit like a product of its time, but, still, Björk was in full force on this thing in terms of, fusing elements of cutting-edge dance and electronic music and pop music. The vocals, of course, were on another level in comparison with any other pop artists out there during her heyday. Really, and honestly, I can't not say this the more I kind of stand here on screen and look at this. The thing about the album that has truly aged the worst is probably the cover. The very weird racial cosplay going on with this is definitely not the best. But, who am I to hold that against one of the most cutting-edge pop albums of all time? I would put this very firmly in the A tier. Okay, at number 5, we have the WuTang Clan's 36 Chambers. In my opinion, the gold standard for hardcore East Coast hip-hop, just letting insane one-liners fly in every direction. Great, crazy, insane, huge group dynamics. Some of the best and most unique rappers in all of New York on one record in one group with amazing songs, fantastic choruses, and of course, the game-changing production from the one and only the RZA. I've heard this, you've heard this, I've reviewed this record before as well. It's stellar. It just kind of ages like fine wine with every year. Pretty much every rap group aspires to have the energy and the electricity, the explosivity, and the long-term cultural splash that the Wu-Tang has had. And, that wouldn't have occurred if not for having put out a record as amazing as this. I'm throwing this in the S Of course, where else would it go? Okay, at number 4 on Pitchfork's list, we have an album that I have not really gone at length about before. That would be Liz Phair's Exile in Guyville. Long considered to be a classic for women in slacker rock and indie rock, and, I get and I understand why. It was certainly, ahead of the curve when it comes to, a lot of the angstier, bitter, fed up, very aggressive, raw female singers and songwriters that, were very popular throughout the mid to late 90s. Now, of course, in the underground, Liz was far from the only artist at the time who was delivering these feminist narratives in a very raw and aggressive and straightforward way. But there were few out there who were as bold in terms of approach and tone as she was. And you have to admire the fact that something at one time that made her a pariah ended up being, I guess, a positive thing to bank on, because as the years have drawn on, the record just seems to be more and more well received. While there are some aspects to this kind of homespun project that I admire, I kind of feel like this placement is somewhat in line with, again, the live through this inclusion on this top 10. While, yeah, do I like the messaging on this record? Do I like the lyrics and the storytelling? What the substance of all that is, of course. But that doesn't mean that I have to ignore my feelings that this album is a little bloated. The performances are not that great. The production, while raw and kind of noisy, is blemished to a fault. The vocals are sort of subpar on a lot of these cuts as well. But that's not to say that the album doesn't have its merits and its good songs. It does. It's just not like a perfect record or, in my opinion, a top 10 record. I mean, when it comes to this decade and it comes to this era, in my opinion, there are simply better songwriters, better vocalists, but what Exile in Guyville did, and should not be ignored, is that it definitely started a spark culturally, which ended up inspiring a host of other artists, many of whom I just find to be more compelling. So again, would I put this in my top 10 for the 90s? No, probably not. Maybe top 50, even though I'm not head over heels for this thing. I would warn anybody who might potentially ignore this album or kind of avoid it or whatever to not do so. It is something that you should try, and I think it is kind of an essential part of 90s underground music culture. Liz Phair, Exile in Guyville. I'd put it in B. All right, next at number 3 on Pitchfork's 90s list, we have Radiohead with OK Computer, another record whose praises I have sung over and over and over again. I think the album has continued to age well over the years, outside of the fact that, maybe it seems a little less unique than it did at one time, mostly because many of its aesthetics and sonics and ideas have been so mercilessly, ripped off by countless artists out there. But for its time, I think this album was, and still stands to be, a very eerie, unsettling, kind of sterile, cold, futuristic look at rock music, with some of the most beautiful and melancholic songwriting of this era. Plus, I think this album is an interesting cultural barometer because it came out so late in the 90s. It feels like we're on the cusp of another Nirvana-esque kind of change or shakeup. A very sick and frigid and dark future is ahead. And I think Radiohead kind of soundtracked that in their own way with OK Computer. I would put this in the S2. I'm running out of S room. Why are all these albums so good? And here's another amazing one. Lauryn Hill, Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. Incredible album. Great vocals, lots of tracks, great songs, fantastic performances. Very unique and well done blend of hip hop and soul and R&B. This album is so freaking good. Lauryn repeatedly gets thrown into, GOAT and greatest of all time conversations as far as hip hop goes. And very rarely are artists sort of thrown into those convos off of just one album. I would throw this all the way up in the S tier, just kind of squeak it in there. And finally, what do we have? It is the My Bloody Valentine album, Loveless. Pretty much the gold standard when it comes to shoegaze music. I would pretty much agree. I can't think of not even a single shoegaze album or shoegaze inspired record that I enjoy more than this album. My Bloody Valentine is just really in a unique position of being one of the first artists to really do what they did, and still, even with so little output since the release of this record, managing after all this time to be quite possibly the best band in this genre ever. With that being said, though, the record is obviously very noisy. It's very psychedelic. It is very difficult to pull apart at points in terms of like what is what when you're listening to the massive and colorful saturated walls of sound throughout this project. There are some moments where it is so hazy, things get a little tedious, in my opinion, just a touch, just a tad, but it's still a beautiful and cutting edge album that, after all these years, remains to be one of the most influential and unique of its kind. And, certainly deserves all the praise it has received, and probably even more that I'm willing to give it in this video. I'm feeling like a bit of an A tier on this one. Still excellent, still amazing, and super classic, though I may not be, just on the edge of my seat throughout the entire thing. But yeah, that is going to be my list here. That's pretty much Pitchfork Top 10 90s Albums tier list. There you go. Let me know what you guys think of all of these albums. Love them, hate them. What would you rate them? You're the best. You're the best. What should I tier out next? Over here next to my head, another video you can check out. Hit that up or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, Tiers, 90s, Pitchfork, forever.